before the episode, we want to thank a couple of our Patreon supporters. Thank you, Eileen, Jordan, Stacy, Rebecca, and Jessica. We really, really appreciate you and the things that your support lets us do, like hire paid staff writers for sartorialgeek.com and pay for this podcast and all of the editing and things that go along with it. If you want to join them, go to patreon.com/sartorialgeek. You can check out all of our cool rewards there, and we would super, super appreciate it. This episode is sponsored by Karen Hallion. Karen Hallion is an incredible illustrator who creates beautiful fandom art. If you enjoy the types of fandoms that we talk about on this podcast, you're really gonna like Karen's work. You can buy prints, stickers, and other products at KarenHallion.com. And you can also check out her Patreon and join the 1,000 other people who support her art at patreon.com/KarenHallion. Hi, welcome to the Sartorial Geek podcast. I'm Jordan Ellis of Jordandene, and I am so excited to have romance author Sarah MacLean here today.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks so much for having me.
We're actually both in Brooklyn, but separately in Brooklyn right now.
Separate. Well, I don't know about you. I live on a third floor of a walk up, and like my apartment is just basically filled with like books and, you know, nightmarish housekeeping. So
yeah, my last
apartment happier was to do it this way.
4th floor walk up. So fully understand that.
Yeah. I just imagine you like surrounded by like the mice from Cinderella all making clothes.
Basically. And I'm in Bushwick, so I'm like actually surrounded by mice and rats all the time. It's so fun.
Not from Cinderella.
Not from Cinderella. So if anyone listening doesn't know who you are, well, first of all, we just launched a romance collection, just the teaser of it. But Yay. Also you like have written a zillion romance novels, which is so impressive.
I feel very slow in the romance world. Romance writers write so fast, and I write about a book a year. But I'm working right now on my 15th.
That's so wild.
And I'm so excited that there is romance gear now in the world, like fandom gear, because
and there's more coming.
Yeah, there's more coming. I'm super excited. I mean, I just think it's really funny because as I know that you have lots of lots of listeners and fans from fandom, and romance is sort of its own. It's very similar to kind of any big fandom world, like because we're all sort of quietly over in our corner, like geeking out about the books that we love and the tropes that we love and the genre. And nobody outside of that world has any idea what we're doing or why we are the way we are. So,
and I am like, just from, just from working on the collection, which again, it's still just the beginning, and talking to you and listening to your podcast, Fated Mates. I'm realizing how much there is. Like, I've known about romance for probably my whole life. Like, that's maybe one of the, like, you know, when there used to be books in grocery stores and there would be like the romance novel section. But I didn't know like how much is happening in the world of romance until probably the last 2 months. And it's amazing. Like, the community is huge, and the things that are happening in romance and the conversations that are happening. And yeah, like you were saying, like the tropes, like you can dive so deep. And I'm just learning about that, and it's super cool.
Yeah. Well, it's really funny. I was on Twitter the other day. I spend too much time on Twitter. But I was on Twitter the other day, and I was reading a thread about there's only one bed, the trope. There's only one
that was bed. On the podcast that I was just listening to of yours, and I was like, what is that?
And well, it was really funny because it was all about how in fanfic, like one of the big things that fanfic writers often write is like, you know, there's only like 2 people in it, like, I don't know, somewhere, and there's only one bed. So they like have to share a hotel room, or they have to share, you know, space in some way. It's in romance, we call this forced proximity. And I was like, it's so funny that this trope, which is so popular, essentially this whole thread was about, I think it was about like some kind of fanfic in like the Marvel universe, and how like there's only one bed. It's just like there are several writers who are just always writing that with different characters. And I was like, it's so funny that this is such a big thing in fanfic, but it's like been in romance since the dawn of the genre. Like this is we shine right in only one bed. And so it's just really fun. And it's really, I feel like there's a really wonderful place for this marriage. And so when we met for the first time, I was like, oh, this is all going to work out really well. Like it feels like you get us. One of us.
It is. So. Yeah, it is kind of surprising how not strong like the tie between romance and fanfic is, at least like that I've seen, because it seems like they are so like perfect best friends.
Yeah. Well, I do think there is, I think a lot. Well, the biggest romance novel of the last decade, 50 Shades, is fanfic, right? It's Twilight fanfic. So, and it came to be as chapter by chapter. And so I think so, and that sort of birthed a lot of big authors who were doing the same thing. Christina Lauren, who's a huge romance. They're a romance writing duo, but they were also part of that Twilight crew. Anna Todd was part of that Twilight crew. And they all came up through there. And they birthed this kind of real new genre. They revolutionized romance in about a decade ago. And now, I think we're seeing more and more, writers of fanfic moving into romance, because that kind of, I don't know about I know other people disagree, but for me, like if they're not kissing, I don't want to know about it.
Isn't that part of your tagline for your bio? Something about kissing.
I write books, there's smooching in them. So
right.
And there is, like, guarantee there. I will never. I can promise you now. I make this my solemn vow. There will always be kissing. So it's really, you're totally right. But also, like, it feels, romance has that feel. We talk all the time about how romance novels are designed to be read really quickly. Like I say, if it takes you more than 6 hours to read one of my books, I've done something wrong. And the idea is I want it to feel sticky. I want you to not be able to put the book down. I want it to feel the same as, how it feels to watch a great television show and like be desperate at the commercial break, right, for the next one, or be desperate at the end for the next one. Yeah. And I think of chapter breaks as commercial breaks, or as episode breaks. And I want you to binge it. That's what the books are for. And, rabid romance readers. The average romance reader reads about 10 to 12 books a month. And
gosh, that's so wild.
I know. And it's because we love this genre so much. We love what it means. We love the stories that it tells. We love that it puts us, at the center of the story, and it centers us in happiness and in joy and in triumph. And for so many years, women and marginalized people have been put on the page to sort of suffer and be martyred and die. And that's not what romance is for. The cornerstone of romance is happily ever after. So there is this sort of constant sense of, the books delivering you life in triumph, which we could all, I think, have a little more of.
That's so beautiful, and also so similar to like why people get into fandom in general. Like that, that overlap is so strong. It's like some version normally of like not feeling like you belonged at some point, or like not feeling like your story was told, and then you find the thing where like you are celebrated, or like, whatever that is. That's so cool.
Well, there's this sort of, it feels like in fandom, there is so much this idea of like the heroes of their own story, right? Like every character has the opportunity to be a hero. Every character has the opportunity to be, the person or the thing that changes the world, that saves the world, that impacts the story in a transformative way. And that's what romance is always. It's always about, 2 or 3 or more characters who fall in love and transform each other, transform the world around them. It obviously varies between the subgenres of the larger genre, but in every romance, people are changing for the better, and they're doing it. Ordinary people are doing it in really extraordinary ways, and their sort of superpower is love, right?
Yeah.
Which is a superpower we all have access to.
That's so cool. And also, if anyone hasn't like dipped their toes into romance in a while, the genre I feel like it has changed a lot since, like, I feel like when I was a kid, it was like, oh, romance novels are like a man and a woman. And I'm sure there was more that I didn't know about, but it felt very like old fashioned, like my like old school incorrect version of romance. And like, if anyone like me hasn't updated what they know of the genre lately, that is not all you can expect from romance books now.
No, I mean, the genre, so romance is only about 50 years old.
That's wild.
It's built on the back of, obviously, like, Jane Austen is the first contemporary romance novelist, right? Like, she was writing romance novels about her world. But, if we move forward, what I mark as the first modern romance, and what most, at least American authors or experts in the genre mark as the first modern romance, is the first book where we saw a heroine on the page, the story centered on her, the story written through the female gaze rather than the male gaze, which is what so much media and around us is always centering the male gaze. But it also put sex on the page, and it gave her it gave her sex and didn't punish her for it. And she has an orgasm on the page, like there's actual real sex on the page. And so that's what we mark as the first romance. And that was published in 1972. So we're a relatively young genre. I mean, YA is probably the only genre that's younger than us. And so what's remarkable about that is you can sort of reach back to the beginning, and you can mark time in history and in culture, particularly in American culture, with romance novels. And the reality is like all the terrible things that have been part of our culture for, longer than 50 years, but that have evolved over the last 50 years have evolved in romance. So those early books were largely white, largely cis, largely het, and now we're starting, but as time progressed, we started to see, romance characters, main characters diversify, the worlds become populated with more diverse characters. And now I feel like we're in this really magnificent heyday of the genre where no matter what your identity, no matter what your kink, no matter what you're interested in, you can find a romance novel that suits you. And that includes even, ace and arrow people can find themselves in romance novels, which I think is a really like lovely new modern convention.
Yeah, yesterday I was listening to one of your most recent Fated Mates episodes, which was like the Q&A, like throw a collection of like
stump us.
Yeah, like, and so the descriptions of
we threw you into the deep end of the pool with that, Jordan.
I loved it because
that's
I was
a crazy episode.
It was amazing because some of them I can't remember exactly, but it would be like, a romance with 2 people in this setting and like maybe vampires, and you guys were like, yes, got it. Like there were books.
Oh yeah, that was a wild one. That was a wild ride. It was like plus size heroines focused on fashion, bonus points for vampires. What?
And every single time like a description was read, I was like, there's no way there's this book, and then there it is. So I think that is like, I mean, I've noticed that as I've met more indie authors and like seen things that like there are way more books happening in the world than who is like, I am trying to learn everything that's happening in the book world, and I'm not in it as much, so it's taking me longer and I'm slower. And like there is so much more happening than what I thought. Like there's so much overlap of genres. There are so many like super specific books that I think that is what reminds me of fandom, where you're like, how this is so specific. There's no way anyone other than just me wants this, but like, surprise, there are, and it's
somebody's
amazing.
There. Somebody's out there. I mean, that's the coolest thing. And I mean, look, the reality is like, I love romance. I mean, it will come as no surprise that like I love romance so much, and not just because I write it. Like I've been reading it since I was 10 or 11. Like I'm obsessed with this genre, and I mean I just love every corner of it. But what's really interesting is it has always been about centering fantasy and desire and self and pleasure and these kind of things that seem to be verboten in the rest of the world, like things that that the rest of the world sort of shames us for. Romance has always said, you're safe here with us thinking about these things, right? Like no matter what your fantasy, no matter what your pleasure, we've got you. Like, and that really does mean like, I want a queer romance about a chef and a mechanic. And I want there to be pegging and, like, or whatever it is. And we can find that for you. And if it doesn't exist, like there's also space for you to write it, and you're welcome in our pool. And I think that is now, did that happen 50 years ago? Probably not as much. Certainly not for that particular example. But now it's happening more and more. And I really feel like, that's what we're giving the world, is this sort of awareness of like, love is powerful. Sex is not shameful. Sex is something to take pleasure and power from, and nobody's going to shame you here.
And I think that's something that, I mean, again, part of the reason I had so many like wrong and old ideas about romance is that I had never like dived into the community as an adult. But I remember like learning that the romance genre can be feminist or like is feminist. And I was like, wait, what? That seems wrong, but like it isn't, which is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting because obviously you sort of look at those old books when we think about when somebody who doesn't know anything about the genre thinks about romance, they think about Fabio, right? Like they think about those sort of like old covers with like Fabio's hair flying. And I mean, to be honest, I read all those books and I love them all so much. But they think about, the bodice ripper, the kind of the rapey hero who, throws the heroine over his shoulder and like takes her off to, be patriarchy for her. Right.
Yep.
And I think like that toxically masculine hero did exist for many, many years. But I think that when you talk to somebody who knows about the genre, there's a reason why he existed, right? Like in the 1970s, just to sort of give you a little bit of a picture, like, the first romance was published in 1972. At that same time, Congress was debating the Equal Rights Amendment. Gloria Steinem stood up in front of the DNC at the convention that year and said, if the Democratic Party doesn't do more for women, it's going to lose women forever. And Democrats can't win without women. It was this time when, legally a woman couldn't be raped by her husband. Like there was actually no recourse for marital rape in the courts. Married women couldn't have their own credit cards or their own bank accounts. These kinds of things, 50 years ago 1972 doesn't feel like that long ago, but it was archaic for us. Totally. And what was happening is inside these fluffy books, like behind these crazy Fabio covers, these conversations were being had, right? Like women, heroines were getting raped on the page, but like that was being called that. The word was being spoken on the page. Heroines and authors were claiming it as rape. And so what was ending up, and what was happening in these books, the transformation in these books was the hero who starts off, toxic masculinity, pure distilled patriarchy. And through the course of the book, through love and through the heroine's influence, becomes kind of softer and kinder and more of an equal partner. And that story gets told over and over and over again in these books. At the same time, the covers are really basically like they're a giant blinking sign that says, men keep out. Right. So the conversation is being had between women, about women's issues, about the world that women dominate and the world that women populate. And so the conversation, when you start to think about it that way, the books start to feel really subversive. Like this conversation is being had right under the noses of patriarchy, without anyone even really knowing, because they're just blowing these books off as like silly little books. But
that's so interesting. That all makes so much sense. I just had never thought
and
of
on
that
top
before.
of it, like think about this, like this transformative. I mean, there's a writer named Susan Elizabeth Phillips who's been writing romance since the 80s, and she says all the time, the reason why rape was on the page in those early days was because the society slut shamed women so much that there was this idea that like good girls didn't give it up before marriage. So like invariably in these like weird rape scenes in these early books, they end in orgasm. So it's like she's being like, she gets she's allowed in some way to take pleasure from sex, but like without having to feel shame for wanting it. Which is a really like wild thought when you think about it. Like this is what those sort of scenes were doing subversively for women and sex, and like freeing the orgasm in some way, which is bananas. And now luckily we're doing something else. But like, I think these kinds of conversations, when you start to have them about romance, it's really interesting. And just going back for a second to fandom, I think these kinds of conversations can be had about a lot of things, right? Like superhero books, for example, comic books rose up alongside, like in the wake of a world war, right? Like these big conversations that are had about community and culture and fear and, something as massive as war. The idea that comic books are a product of that is something that we don't talk about enough. Like there's a reason why superheroes exist, and it's not just about, capes.
Yeah, that's interesting that both of those do kind of have this old mentality of like, oh, you silly little books. Like comic books are for kids, romance novels are like for women. And it is very empowering to think about like what they were actually doing. And that's really, really
And
cool.
I mean, I wonder, like, I don't actually know a whole lot about the history of comics, but like, I wonder if comic writers knew what they were doing. I mean, maybe. But I don't think the early romance writers really knew what they were doing. But I think that's part of when you're writing genre, right? Like true genre fiction, fast and furious, and like in a world that's kind of churning. It's very hard to take a step back and sort of say like, well, what I'm trying to do here is I'm writing commentary on the state of war and the industrial war machine. Like no one knows, like that's not, nobody said that. But at the same time, hindsight is 2020. And when you look back on these books, it's obvious what superheroes mean.
Yeah. That's so cool. I am so thankful that I am working with you now and I have this like new appreciation.
I'm pretty
for
dorky.
The genre. I love it. Well, and also romance is literally perfect for me because I may have told you this. People who listen a lot definitely know I am a very slow reader and like I rarely give myself time to read a lot. So romance books are like romance and comics. Honestly, graphic novels, like something I can read in a day is perfect for me. So I think these two are like my new jam.
I'm so glad.
I'm gonna actually read.
I mean, that's so great. I mean, that's what they're for. I think we spend way too much time saying like, oh, when you read, you have to read something that feels like it's, you know, you have to read things that feel hard, you know, read things that make you feel like they're like you're being challenged. And the reality is like you can be impacted and challenged and powerfully moved by text that doesn't require you to like sit down for a month to read it.
God,
you know, we don't need to all read Tolstoy.
Totally.
Like,
reading can be really entertaining too, and still be like, wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, like nobody has to read romance. That part of the joy, right, is like, yes, when I commit romance, I think about all of this stuff. Like that's what's in my brain. But like, that's not what's in the brain of most romance readers. Most romance readers read it just for pure, unadulterated pleasure. And like, there is value in that.
Absolutely.
Alone. If they did nothing else but give people pleasure, that would be enough.
Yeah. I feel like this is the perfect time to ask, like, if someone's listening and is like, oh, yes, I would love to dive either back into or for the first time into this wild world of romance, where do you start? Because there is so much out there.
It's huge. It's a huge pool. So there are, you know, you can get, what I said earlier is true. You can get a romance for you can get historicals, you can get paranormals, you can get contemporaries, you can get, you know, whatever you are looking for, you can find sci-fi, urban fantasy. And so what I would actually recommend is I have a website. I have a page on my website that is about 200 really great romances. Not obviously all written by me. And if you go there, you'll see I've written sort of a 2-line description of each one.
Amazing.
Like, so you can you can search for things that you're interested in. You can just scroll and look at all the covers and see what sort of turns you on. But I would absolutely, maybe you can maybe like put it in show notes or we can link to it, but It's actually at sarahmaclean.net/recommended. But if you go to just sarahmaclean.net, it's one of the buttons on the main page and you can scroll. So I would start there, like scroll there and see what looks good. There are lots and lots. There's Fated. You can always listen to an episode or two. You can listen to the most recent episode of Fated Mates. And if there's a trope you really like, if you're like, oh, I really wish I could read something about like curvy heroines or, you know, I don't know, escorts or road trip romances or historical romances. Fated Mates has episodes on all of those different kinds of tropes. And you could always start with me. Yeah. Not to toot my own horn,
absolutely.
But if you're interested in historical romance at all, if you're willing to try historical romance, I think my newest series is a pretty solid place to start. The first book in the series is called Wicked and the Wallflower, and the premise of the books is it's 3 siblings who had to run from a terrible home life, and they landed themselves as children in London in the 1830s, and they build themselves into criminal royalty. And they are smugglers and bare knuckle fighters. And the book that I'm writing right now is about a woman who owns a Magic Mike XXL style brothel. It's really fun. And there's a lot of, rooftop shenanigans.
I love that. That's so awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to me. Like, I learned a lot, which is very cool. And I am super motivated now to go actually like check out all the things that are happening in romance.
I feel like it's
Jordan, for me.
I'm so thrilled about this new collection. I'm so cool. The teaser is perfect. And I'm really, really excited for February for the whole line. So
Valentine's Day, everyone stick around. We'll be doing some even cooler things. I can't wait. This is such a fun collab. I'm so excited. And I'm excited for your new book coming out.
Thank you. Yeah, it's coming in the summer. So there's a little bit of time, but thanks so much for having me, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you can head to our archives to hear more or hit subscribe to hear what's coming up next. If you want to go a step above and beyond, you can leave us a review on iTunes, which helps other nerdy people find us. Or you can go to patreon.com/sartorialgeek to help keep the podcast going and check out the cool rewards that we have over there. Have a great week and stay nerdy.